Hello, everyone. First and foremost, and welcome to today's webinar. Really, I want to say thank you all for joining us to discuss our recently released report entitled Expanding the Scope of Commercial Opportunities for Investor-Owned Electric Utilities. My name is Peter Kappers, and I'll be your MC today. I'm joined today by my colleague and the primary author of the report, Cameron Brooks, who will be presenting today's material. Before we get started, I've got a few housekeeping items to cover with you all. First, our plan is to spend about 35 to 40 minutes on our formal presentation of the report, leaving the remainder of the hour to answer any questions you might have. Since everyone's on mute, please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen to pose any questions that might arise during the presentation itself. I'll be collecting and curating those questions as we go through the presentation, and I'll pose them to Cameron after he's done. Lastly, we are recording this webinar, so folks unable to attend today can still access it. My goal is to get that recording posted alongside the report, ideally by the end of this week. So with that, let me turn the mic over to my partner in crime, Cameron Brooks.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you to all of you who've joined. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to talk about this paper that, while Pete says I'm the primary author, I suppose some of that is true, but Pete and Andy Satchwell and I collaborated pretty closely. So our hope is that we can offer an introduction to the paper, an overview of what it is, and perhaps what motivated it in the first place and what contribution we hope it might offer to the broader conversation about the evolution of the utility system in the United States in the recent past and looking forward into the near future. And like Pete said, hopefully we'll be able to entertain a few questions and a little bit of a discussion near the end. So overall, I would say that this paper was motivated by two pieces of a macro level observation that were hardly the first or the only ones to make, which is really that new technologies are giving customers of all scales new options for generating, managing, and consuming their electricity. And that's changing in some fundamental ways the traditional, utility business model. So we note in the paper that there's a considerable body of literature ranging from how utilities have implemented programs, for example, promoting energy efficiency or demand side management, to the more conceptual examinations of the overall utility business model. But as we looked across the literature, and as we note in the paper, when we observed, well over 100 examples of specific offerings from utilities that we sort of distilled down into a set of generic product offerings. But what we really saw was that there was not anywhere a complete or organized taxonomy, and that's one of the things that motivated this. It's worth noting that this is a fast-moving area, and most of this research was done in 2018 and 2019, and so undoubtedly that landscape is beginning to change. We also recognize that while the taxonomy may be a valuable organizing tool, regulators still have to adjudicate specific proposals and rationalize their responses to those within the context of their own state policies and with their peers in the regulatory community. So while we recognize there's a wide range of complicated, overlapping, and state-specific issues, we were motivated to try to identify and organize these policy-related questions that surround alternative commercial opportunities. So towards that end, we offer a more detailed examination of 6 major policy issues that all have underlying questions associated with them, and provide some guiding questions that we hope might offer regulators and policymakers some kind of guidance or inspiration when undertaking a review of a specific proposal, or when embarking on a broader consideration of what their overall policy strategy might be in a state. So taking these two pieces together, we really hope that this report can be a research that supports informed, robust consideration of alternative commercial opportunities and strategic planning in the utility space. Now, before I get into the details of both the taxonomy and the surrounding policy questions, I want to pause for a minute on this phrase that you might have heard me use a couple of times, and it's doing a lot of work in the past few sentences, and that's alternative commercial opportunity. So what exactly does that mean, and what does it not mean? So we really start with this observation that utilities have two broad portfolios of service. It's delivering electricity, and to some extent, it's everything else, which we call here alternative commercial opportunities. So delivering electricity is, of course, no small thing, especially as it's been highlighted in the past week or so. And by no means do we intend to diminish that complicated and critical service. And we recognize that within delivering electricity, there's a wide range of rate structures, designation of customer classes, performance standards, and regulatory strategies. We're not intending in this paper to be an examination of new rate structures or time-based rates or performance-based regulations, those things that sort of hit all customers in a more generalized way. And we also recognize that within everything else, there's potentially a vast expanse of business opportunities that a utility might pursue. And so we're similarly not proposing to look at the risk of being somewhat flippant, whether PG&E might propose and win support from their shareholders a plan to open up a chain of pizza restaurants. So that kind of gets to two important characteristics of what is in this paper an alternative commercial opportunity. The first is that it really has to involve some kind of distinct transaction with a specific customer. And like I mentioned before, that's opposed to investments that include the overall rate base or that are included in riders. And second, it must leverage or in some way enhance the regulated assets of the utility or the capabilities of the regulated utility. So there has to be some connection to the sphere of regulation. So for example, a customer receiving a credit or a payment for providing demand reduction from their thermostats, for our purposes, that's in. Installing a battery that's connected to the distribution system and is included in the rates for all customers in the rate base, that's out. Similarly, using ratepayer funds to invest in electric vehicle charging is in. And as I mentioned before, trying to use shareholder dollars to open up a pizza chain, that's out. So, hopefully that helps define what we mean here. As we got more into it and we took those 80 generic offerings that I'd mentioned before, and we started to organize them and group them and try to build a taxonomy that I'm going to get into a little bit more, we defined three broad categories of these alternative commercial opportunities. So the first is value-added services, where there's an additional service that's coupled with the delivery of electricity or is somehow directly related to electricity delivery. There's energy products, which includes a broad suite of devices and services that'll use electricity. And then there's adjacent services. And so this kind of captures a lot of those offerings that might not directly relate to energy delivery, but that leverage the regulated assets of the utility in some way. Within these three broad categories, we found clusters of what we considered to be 19 portfolios of products and services that you see up here on this chart and sort of organized around these three broad classes that I mentioned before. And I'll just pause here for a minute to say we recognize there's a great diversity of services, for example, that provide load management or energy storage. And we recognize that, there's a lot of overlap. And this is really just one way of organizing this taxonomy. Certainly others might come up with some other kind of organizing schema. So, you know, we're not saying this is the only way, but it's really what emerged. And again, I highlighted this before, but you know, some of this research was done a couple of years ago, or maybe starting a couple of years ago, and certainly a lot has changed, and things are moving pretty quickly. So there may be new categories and new ways of conceptualizing some of what we have here. I'm not going to walk through all of these in great detail, but I would like to maybe just offer a few examples. So if we talk about here the value-added services, as I said before, these are things that we see that are connected directly to the delivery of electricity, but that maybe have some kind of extra twist on them. So you can look, for example, at what we term here differentiated generation, which is essentially electricity, but coming from a specific trackable source. Or things like power quality or reliability, where the demands of the customer might require some, or might be advantaged by the utility providing some specific equipment that's dedicated to the customer and that then they're charged for more directly. The second area is what we term, or what we kind of put into a category of thinking about derivative services. So this incorporates energy delivery, but with an additional layer of information or some other kind of service in the case of data analytics, or some other kind of application, let's say in the case of electric transportation, or connecting to local resources or customer-owned assets in the case of microgrids. And again, just to pause for a minute, I mean, microgrids and their management is a really good illustration of how cross-cutting and interrelated all of these services can be. So we're not trying to get too prescriptive about how these can or should be organizing, because microgrids presumably cross a lot of these different categories. So your results may vary to some degree, and we hope they will, because it would be consistent with one of our primary motivations, which is really to help inform and enrich this conversation. So finally, in this first category of value-added services, there's another subcategory, what we call grid services. So these are both reductions in total electricity consumption, so what you might think of as traditional energy efficiency that result in a reduction of demand, but maybe not at specific times. And we distinguish that from load management that might be responding to some kind of specific event. In the broad class of energy products, there's a wide range of specific products or platforms that help customers access those products, but that hopefully are coupled with some kind of other benefits. So, you know, it's not necessarily just the products themselves. It's certainly an area that has seen a lot of attention over the last few years is utility-hosted online marketplaces, which help customers get access to certain products, but also products that might, especially in aggregate, have some kind of benefit or capability that the utility or customers might be able to tap into at a broader level. And finally, there is a wide range of what we call adjacent services, where there might not be a direct connection to electricity delivery, but that leverage existing utility assets like their communications network or the physical infrastructure to be able to do things like gunshot detection, where sensors might be out in the field and use the utilities network to bring information back. Some of these we postulated. So there certainly are examples now of utilities making some of their network capabilities available, but there are also opportunities that have been postulated by others that we sort of captured around things like using their workforce or their customer relations capabilities, things like call centers, to to be available for other kinds of services and maybe to support, especially like municipal operations. So as I say, this is kind of a broad sense of the categorization of the taxonomy. And I guess I want to, again, pause here for a minute. There's more examples in the report. And while we didn't include all of them here, it is based on a relatively exhaustive review of regulatory filings, academic literature, and media reports. But I want to offer now both an acknowledgement and a bit of a disclaimer. The acknowledgement is that all regulated utilities exist in a world today that's inextricably linked to the history of the industry and how the industry has co-evolved, and also to various theories of regulation that really vary from state to state. Certainly not the first to observe that the regulatory environment in Georgia is very different than that in Illinois and very different than that in Colorado. But paramount among all of these is some concept of the natural monopoly and a recognition that the macro trend I mentioned at the beginning, that new technologies are changing the consumer and the utility landscape, it's linked to this history and to certain milestone legislations such as PURPA or market reforms like restructuring of many wholesale markets in the 1990s and early 2000s, and then the further advent of retail competition in many states. So the alternative commercial opportunities that we describe are in many ways simply the last chapter, perhaps, or the latest chapter of evolutions that have long wavelengths that have been going through the industry, perhaps even directly connected to how, as technology has evolved, that has opened up new opportunities for regulators to change the fundamental footprint of the regulated utility. So that's an acknowledgement. The disclaimer is that in our discussion of these policy issues, we don't intend in any way to present an implicit bias or preference towards the traditional business model. Obviously, there are many industry observers that have identified barriers to innovation that are deeply embedded in the regulatory process. And our literature review certainly came across quite a few examples of that. And some of those observers have encouraged regulators to take aggressive action with regard to how the relationship between utility companies and competitive market models are set up. These are definitely complicated subjects and they're worthy of a lot of detailed examination, but that examination is beyond the scope of this report. So, I just want to make clear, we're not necessarily arguing one way or another that utilities can or should, or that it's preferred in some way that they pursue these. We just wanted to identify some of the issues that if they do, how might regulators consider those? So as I said, there are a lot of policy questions that get triggered or become implicated as you start to look at some of these possible business opportunities for utilities. Dozens and dozens of questions that came up that as we tried to look at this, both thinking about the sequencing of how regulators and policymakers might consider these questions and also some kind of logical grouping, we tried to take a lot of these questions and put them into these 6 categories that you see up here. So going from left to right, again, with some hope that these provide a logical sequencing, there's questions around market structure, competition, market risk strategy, what the value to consumers is, what's the best business model for that, and how might this proposed activity by the utility contribute to larger strategic questions about the transition of the industry into other areas. So as I said before, it's really a major motivation of ours to offer some guiding questions. And many of these questions have already been raised in regulatory proceedings that surround the pursuit of these issues. So I'd like to take a few minutes just to walk through what these mean. So market structure. And first, I should say that with all of this, like with the taxonomy, there's probably a bunch of different ways to organize the questions that get triggered and that regulators might grapple with. So this is just, one way of organizing those. But there is some logic, and hopefully there is some sequencing. So the first of these, market structure, is really a set of threshold questions that define at a more macro level what's the market and what is the footprint of the regulated utility, and does this commercial opportunity fit into that footprint or not? Does it fit into the existing footprint as it's more or less been defined through previous regulatory decisions, or should we as policymakers either expand or contract that footprint? The delineation of this market boundary is particularly important now because as technology has changed and advanced, the perspectives of some regulators and legislatures concerning what should be protected, what needs to be protected from a monopoly utility point of view, that may have changed. Some regulators look at the changing economies of scale and they determine that the footprint of the utility probably should shrink. Others look at the same thing or look at a different set of questions surrounding the new technology and say innovation might be supported by expanding the footprint of the utility into areas that they hadn't traditionally been either allowed to or inclined to operate in, but that might support innovation, especially if it's done in a strategic way. So in the paper, because we wanted to try to help make this a little bit more grounded, we use the example of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And so I'm just wanted to sort of touch on that here as well. So, at the first level, the question of market structure, as I explained before, just what's in, what's out. So, there's a question here, and it certainly has come up in many proceedings and in many state actions. Does electric vehicle charging infrastructure, should that be a monopoly function that we want the regulated utility to pursue? Or conversely, is it something that we absolutely don't want them to be pursuing? There's corresponding questions about whether we should be including all of the make-ready investments that would go into the infrastructure up to the site, but perhaps not the charging infrastructure itself. So none of these are particularly, easy or obvious questions to answer, but it really is one of the first threshold questions. What is the role of the utility with regard to those investments? Is it in the footprint? Is it out of the footprint? I'll note here, if you look at this slide, that there's a number of similar areas that face similar questions, that are not necessarily cut and dry examples. So, intelligent homes, are the devices inside? Is that within the utility footprint? Questions around connected cities, and we mentioned before, like gunshot detection or other field sensors. Where do we want to place those? The second broad category was around competition. So if market structure defines this threshold question about the macro level footprint of the utility monopoly, then the next threshold question is, what is the role of competitive non-utility players? Are they allowed to compete directly? Can they be service providers to the utility? At some level, if market structure creates the playing field, then the questions around competition defines who can step onto that field and what are the rules of the game. It's also worth noting, as I said before, that those rules might change over time, especially if that's part of the longer term strategy for the state to be able to help foster some kind of innovation, but have the utilities' role be time bounded in some way or phased in some way. So, by design, utilities might seek for policymakers and regulators might seek for utilities to take the first steps, but then introduce competitive forces into a market that's now been incubated. This question, I think, is particularly important in part because many regulators will observe themselves that their role is essentially to try to mimic the results of an open and competitive market. And going back to that question of natural monopoly, recognizing that in certain situations, competition might not lead to the best social outcome, even though in general, regulators, economic regulators in particular, believe that the result that they're trying to mimic is that of an openly competitive market. So these become very relevant questions. In the context of EV infrastructure, it really becomes a question of who's going to own that charging service and what's the relationship between either that entity and the utility, or if that is the utility, that the utility and other players in the marketplace. Again, are they given an exclusive franchise, or are they given a very limited franchise? Are they allowed to compete in a field that includes others, or is everyone else kept off of that field? On the market risk strategy, it's a broad set of questions about how to mitigate, or maybe better how to mitigate and allocate the risks that come along with a new venture. Because there's really not just one dimension of risk, and it doesn't lie on one single continuum. So going back to the question of competition, some might argue for a more open field for competitor, or some might argue that a more open field brings risks to consumers from nefarious behavior or makes them vulnerable to new companies that are coming in. Others might argue that private capital will actually reduce risk for consumers, especially with regard to things like stranded assets in a very fast-changing technology landscape. And as we know, risks come in a lot of different forms, just broadly physical, financial, and security risks. There's questions about which risks are inherent to the electric industry itself, so perhaps can be controlled directly, and which ones are exogenous, like wildfires or market shocks, or like we're seeing right now, extreme weather events. As primarily economic regulators, the typical path, or at least one of the most dominant tools available to them, are business models and rate design, which we're going to touch on in just a minute. But I think it's helpful to first identify what those risks are and what general strategies might be for how they should be apportioned. So it's a bit of a balancing act, I guess, would be the bottom line. There's obviously no right answer, and it's going to become a question of a policy determination to figure out, well, if we allow, for example, utilities to provide electric vehicle charging infrastructure, does that lower costs for consumers, perhaps in the short run? Is there a risk that it actually increases costs for them over the long run if there isn't the proper level of competition that's going to help bring those costs down? How do we know some of those questions? Are there certain mechanisms, again, that we'll touch on related to the business model that might be implemented that shift risks from consumers onto shareholders, or vice versa? All very complicated questions, but starting with just trying to identify what those risks are and which party is bearing them. The question of the customer value case, again, there's no simple formula to determine what's in the best interest of the customer, but it's obviously very closely connected to this question of risk. But having determined what the playing field is, brought in the players to be on that field and defined the rules of the game, hopefully to minimize the risks or at least to know who's bearing which risks, then there's a question of, is it worth it? Is there really a there? So that's what the customer value case determines, is whether the proposed use of these regulated assets or the regulated capital is going to bring compelling benefits for the traditional electricity customer, as well as those who would take advantage of this new commercial opportunity that's being proposed. There obviously are some traditional mechanisms that have been used, especially around demand side management and energy efficiency. So, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the sort of cost tests that are one way of trying to answer this question about the customer value case. But I think, one of our observations would be that it's that those may not be fully up to the challenge of being applied in these cases where the new commercial opportunities are just very, very different than sort of the single focus efforts around either load management or energy efficiency. So in the case of electric vehicles, this really does raise a whole set of different questions around what the customer needs and what's going to benefit the customer. And I think it highlights how interconnected the risk and the reward are. So each of those physical, financial, and security risks have a counterpart when considering the customer value case. Where should charging be located? Is that even a question that regulators need to answer? What's the best way to ensure that costs are reasonable and equitable? Going to that question of cost control. What's the best way to ensure some kind of long-term market development? And again, this gets into that question of whether there are strategic approaches for how to either allow or encourage utilities to pursue some of these areas, but maybe recognizing that over the long term, that's just an initial incubation of a market that then might transition to something that's more fully competitive. The regulatory business model is really where some of these risks get allocated to different stakeholders. So regulators need to ensure that whatever business model they establish appropriately allocates those financial and operational risks between not just electricity consumers and the utility, but also the customers of this new commercial offering, to the shareholders, and to the broader community at large. One of the tools for this is really how the business model is designed. What we identify here is that regulators have four broad elements when determining what's the most appropriate utility business model that financially compensates an investor-owned electric utility for pursuing these new commercial offerings. So I think we're pretty well familiar with rate of return on invested capital. That obviously brings with it certain benefits for the consumer and certain incentives for the utility around building more infrastructure. There's performance incentives that can shift how the utility seeks to deploy its capital, but also raises some questions about exactly how are some of the performance targets, or sorry, the performance metrics, how do those operate? Are they closely tied enough to what the real outcome should be? There's a cost margin approach. So the difference between, essentially what the wholesale cost is and what's being sold. And then there's transaction and performance fees. Again, I'm not suggesting that this is an exhaustive list of everything that's out there, or that any of these is mutually exclusive of the others, but just in terms of broad categorizations, I think these are the tools that regulators generally have available to them. Looking at the question of EV infrastructure, we've got our little Rodin down there in the corner thinking about all these things. You know, it is electric vehicle charging, should that be considered plant from the traditional utility sense? Does it go into rate base accordingly? If it's not plant, does that mean that the utility should be involved in that at all? Or that the regulators have any real say? Should it be set up as a rate-based return or on a sales margin approach? Should the costs and the recuperation or recovery of investment be allocated to all customers or just to the active ones? Again, I mean, I think with each of these, there's dozens and dozens of questions that are not easily answered. But, you know, I think you can get a sense of the overall scope here. So finally, I just want to touch on the idea of transition strategies, where regulators have an opportunity not simply to respond or to encourage proposals from utilities, but to forge new business models for the electric industry, where consumer interactions are as much as part of the solution as traditional energy sources. So when considering some of these new proposals, can regulators also use other ongoing proceedings and commission deliberations to align their outcomes and objectives across multiple utility dockets to really see, is this the first step on the path that we want to be on? Does this help us move towards these transformational and grid modernization strategies? Or is this just sort of a one-off? I'm not sure exactly how to capture such a broad question for the EV space, but you know, clearly there is a lot of movement and a lot of interest in seeing electrification as a solution to climate challenges, to mobility, to questions around social equity. And so, you know, I think hopefully having walked through a series of questions, starting with some of those threshold questions of, do we want the utility to be part of this, to be operating in this space? How does that affect the competitive field? Is there value for the consumer? You know, what's the best business model? To then sort of pause at the end and, you know, make sure to look back over all those decisions and verify and validate that actually this is moving in the direction that we'd like it to move in. So some of the conclusions that that we sort of pull away from this, again, none of these questions are easy, in part because the industry has co-evolved over such a long time. But it's a pretty exciting time now, and we think that there's a confluence that will bring a lot of rich discussions. So we hope that this report is relevant and useful in expanding a meaningful discussion and recognizing that some of these core principles around natural monopoly and consumer protection are facing new challenges or new opportunities. And that these new technologies and having a very engaged customer base are pushing some utilities towards new strategies, having regulators look at how they can align those with other public policy goals. And we hope that this helps further that discussion. So I think that's really the end of my prepared remarks here. Obviously you have links, but we'd love for you to be able to take a little bit more time with the report, and happy to have a bit of a conversation and answer any questions that may have come up.
All right, thanks, Cameron. Yeah, let me take things from here in terms of engaging all of you on the phone with your interest in sort of asking some questions of Cameron in particular, potentially the two of us. So one question that came up, if you went back to slide 13, you mentioned that regulation is in some degree always changing and is adapted many times before. So the question really is there something unique or different about this point in the industry's history?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, and this is just sort of my observation. And what this chart does not have, I think, would be sort of a classic line moving from the lower left and then up towards the upper right in a more geometric fashion. But one of the central premises of the natural monopoly model is that the costs of the infrastructure required and the transaction costs are so high that it really only makes sense for one company to be part of that, or to be providing that. I think what happened into the 80s and 90s, especially around the advent of new combined cycle gas turbines, really fundamentally changed the economies of scale for large power plant production. So the hundreds of megawatt scale, but it went from gigawatts down to hundreds of megawatts, suddenly becoming as efficient from an economic point of view. And customers responding to that by saying, we want to have access to that. Of course, none of these things can be just simply attributed to one factor, but I think there's probably some broad consensus that that was one of the driving forces behind some of the restructuring that happened in the 90s and into the early 2000s. But that really affected the bulk power system. I think what's different today is that technological progression has continued to the point where those economies of scale are now reaching, premise level, household level, perhaps even device level, so that you can really think about how can we aggregate together connected devices, distributed energy systems, intelligent energy, in ways that just haven't existed in the past. And so maybe that's a long-winded way to get to this answer to the question, which is that one of the fundamental things that I see has changed is that the mass market consumer is engaged in a way that they never had been before. The large consumers were engaged around some of the early wave of restructuring. But as we get into this latest wave, it's really reaching down to the level of that individual customer. And so that interplay between what has typically been very passive demand is now a much more dynamic relationship. Pete, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as well, or.
No, I think I think that's to me the realization of that passive versus active customer, and the fact that before, when a lot of the industry evolution has been more about external actors having some ability to now replicate the role of the regulated monopoly utility, in which case the size of that market, really got eroded certainly in some places more than others. But the point being that, it's these external actors that were really the ones affecting the size of that market and shrinking it. But it's the point that now you're getting individuals that can almost be self-reliant. I don't think we're necessarily there, but that's sort of the point. And we're certainly seeing a much greater interest in customers of the utility, not just being consumers of services, but potentially providing those services, that idea of a prosumer, and that just being a fundamental change, that it isn't these just actors outside of the utility sphere, but those within the utility sphere that are also motivating this change in rethinking, that scope and role of the utility and what it means to regulate them. I wonder if this maybe segues then into a question I got about, does this at all suggest that the electric utility industry should be moving towards performance-based regulation, performance-based rates?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's a really good question, and maybe I'll jump to the slide where we sort of had some of the breakdown. I mean, I think that there, in some areas, I think it probably does make sense. I'm not sure that I would think that it makes sense across all categories. So I think part of one of my takeaways certainly is just that as you start to get into some of these other areas, I think perhaps we've been hamstrung a little bit by always trying to think about how do we fit this into a rate of return box. And that's sort of the traditional model. How do we replicate that, even if it doesn't really apply very well to what the commercial offering might be? And I think that there is a risk of that same mindset around performance incentives, to think that it can sort of be the answer for everything. I think part of the point here, and this goes a little bit to the question of risk allocation, is that all of the risks, all of the rewards have slightly different flavors, and so there probably needs to be more nuanced approach than just a one size fits all of moving from one box of rate of return on capital invested to a new box of performance incentives. Might be pigeonholing just as much. So it really is, I think, a recognition that these tools can be applied in different areas and perhaps even be applied in combination.
I think to parlay off of that too, what we're certainly seeing in the industry, even for the exact same type of one of these alternative commercial services, is different jurisdictions choosing potentially different ways to create that business model. So that really speaks to that one size fits all, that it isn't just about, rate of return versus performance incentives. It's, each state, each jurisdiction, in some respects, each utility may be, having its own approach and business model developed for that same service. So I think that type of innovation is really interesting and creates, I think, lots of opportunities for regulators to really think about what this means for them and how do they motivate their utilities to sort of do, in this case, what they might want them to do to achieve some broader policy goal, or get involved in these business opportunities when they might be otherwise somewhat reticent. And I think that somewhat speaks to maybe another question. Obviously, folks, if you've got questions yourselves, please feel free to use that Q&A function, that button at the bottom, to type it in and send it in. But this idea that, this observation, some of this stuff seems pretty high level, right? You've kind of laid out this framework, or I'm sort of paraphrasing, I think, the question as I see it here. We've laid out this framework for how to organize the different services, laid out sort of these issues, policy issues that we think regulators are going to have to at least consider. So I think from your standpoint, of the way the question is phrased, how might regulators actually use the framework that we've developed to make their own decisions?
Yeah, well, obviously, I suppose that kind of gets at this question of, is this report going to provide you all the answers? The answer to that would be no. Does it provide a very specific, let's say, checklist that you can just pull this out and kind of walk through and give scores to different answers and get to your question of whether or not to approve something? Again, I think the answer is no. But I think what our hope would be is that by providing sort of some organization around both what are the types of services that and commercial offerings that regulators might be able to anticipate would come up for conversation, so that it's everything isn't quite so isolated. We hope there's value there. And that these are really a way of sequencing the deliberation, but the questions, the specific questions that regulators are going to need to answer are going to be very different from one state to the next. So questions about, for example, what is the footprint of the regulated monopoly that we want to have in a certain state? That's going to be very different in California than it is in North Carolina and than it is in Texas, who have all come up with very different answers to those questions. But once you start to at least think about what the specific questions are going to be in a different state, then hopefully this framework allows a way to organize and provides perhaps some consistency across the states. That would be the hope. There's certainly no intention to try to put this forward and say, here's your playbook and your checklist and your scorecard and go. But as I said at the beginning, what we didn't see in the literature was a more comprehensive look at the entire landscape around both what the products are and what the commercial offerings might be, and then how to think about the attending policy questions. And I guess the last thought that I would have on that is I've certainly seen, and I'm sure we've all witnessed to some degree, if you ask a question in the wrong order, you might end up going down a rabbit hole that you don't need to go down. So for example, starting with just the business model and saying, well, should we go to performance-based rates or cost-based rate of return regulation? You may have leapfrogged over the question, does it make sense for the utility to be doing any of this at all? And so hopefully there's some logic to the sequencing.
I think actually, Cameron, that segues nicely into another question, because this speaks to that issue of maybe some of those more preliminary questions that regulators should be asking, this idea about market structure and market competition. But the person who posed the question asked if we could elaborate on the difference between those two, because they seem like they could be, sort of the same, one and the same thing.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, I think there is, probably a little bit of a nuance there, and because, one of the primary roles of the regulator is to essentially be able to grant this monopoly franchise. And so kind of by definition, you're defining who's allowed into the party and who's not. So, the analogy that we used in the paper a bit is, the idea of defining what the playing field is and then defining as a second question, who's allowed onto that field. Clearly, they're very related, but I guess the difference that I would see is one between, are we going to include, and I guess I'll go back here because it's probably, are we going to include this broad area of economic opportunity in the footprint of the utility or not? Clearly, as you look at this chart, there's some that are almost unquestionable, power plants, renewable energy. But you start to get into questions around things like microgrids, and it's not entirely clear exactly, what's in and what's out. And so then I think that does kind of bleed into that second question of, well, who are the players that are allowed in? And if we decide that it's either fully in or fully out, then you can move on to the next question of, well, if it's in, do we want to then get a little bit more granular about what exactly is in? To use the microgrid analogy, again, are multi-customer microgrids going to be treated in a fundamentally different way than the microgrid at a campus setting where it's all one customer? I think the reality is that we we are seeing those distinctions, but that it's a slightly different question if we had simply said, microgrids are not part of the footprint here. So hopefully that helps answer that question, but clearly they're very, very related.
And I think to maybe tie this back to the very first question that we had about sort of the industry adapting and changing, right? You've got a number of states that deregulated, said their distribution utilities were no longer allowed to own power plants, had to divest themselves of them. But yet over the last maybe 5 years in particular, you have seen, at least I believe, a few utilities being authorized by their regulators to move into, let's say, community solar gardens, as just one example, right? Where this would appear to be a pretty blanket issue from a market structure standpoint of exclusion, all of a sudden adapts and evolves over time as some of the technology changes and creates now a new opportunity for that to all of a sudden say, well, actually, no, maybe we do want the utility, to be on the playing field in this particular, sort of niche area. And so thinking about that as sort of for any of these types of, services, that it may evolve over time, and it may create the opportunity maybe there now for them to get involved, but that may be temporary, sort of from an infant industry standpoint, or it may be precluded right now. And yet, down the road, those opportunities may open themselves up when these issues of market structure and market competition may suggest it's worth doing. So I think with that, we've come to the top of the hour. Very much appreciate all of your time and sticking with us for the length of the webinar. Thank you again for attending. This will be recorded, as I mentioned, and it'll be posted up on our website, hopefully by the end of the week. If you or anyone else is interested in accessing it, please do point them in that direction. So again, thanks for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all.